everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the City Futures Research Centre seminar series. Before we begin, I would like to show my respects and acknowledge the Bedegal people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which this meeting is being held, and to elders past and present. Now, quickly to some housekeeping. During the presentation, we request that you keep your videos turned off and have your microphones muted. We will be monitoring the chat for questions during the seminar, so please feel free to post them and we will address them at the end of the presentation. This session is also being recorded and the recordings will be uploaded onto the City Futures Research Centre's YouTube channel. I will now hand over to Chris Pettit, who will formally introduce our speaker today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased today to have this opportunity to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Caitlin Buckle. Caitlin has been with us for some time. She is a lecturer in our city planning program, and we're very fortunate to have Caitlin as a fellow of the City Futures. Caitlin's background is in human geography and environmental science. Her research focuses on regional housing, migration policy, city equity, health and wellbeing, and informal housing market change. So a wide berth there around housing. The previous research projects have considered population growth and change in regional cities, lifestyle and sea change migration, barriers to entering home ownership, and the impacts of COVID-19, the pandemic, on formal and informal rental housing markets. Today, Caitlin's presenting some research funded through Uhuru, titled Exploring the Regional Renaissance, Drivers and Management of Population Growth and Changes in Regional Cities. Over to you, Caitlin.
So thanks so much for coming to me talking about this project that I'm quite excited and passionate about. I really like exploring the population change of regional cities and looking at particularly at how interest in lifestyle in regional cities can drive migration and population change. So the sort of background to this research project. Just.
Yeah, that's okay. Oh gosh. Yeah, I can quickly. I'll do what I did last time. Sorry, everyone. The remote has a life of its own today.
You can blame me. I might just not know how to press it.
No, definitely not.
Yay!
Yay, perfect.
Yeah, so basically the genesis of this project was there was a lot of discourse about change in regional cities, a lot of media attention on population growth in particular in regional areas. And this has come out of sort of a history of media narratives about decline of regional areas and concerns about regional development. And a lot of this was related to the pandemic and how the pandemic might have influenced population change in regional Australia and in some regional places around the world as well. So we were really interested in this. We wanted to explore how the pandemic might have changed some migration drivers and see if there was some updated knowledge there. And also look at how some communities might have managed that population change. So the project introduction, the study investigated place-based push and pull factors that explain contemporary population shifts in regional urban centres and how local governments can manage this change through key policy development solutions. So that was our focus. And this project was part of an overall a broader inquiry into looking at population change across Australia. And I just wanted to mention my co-authors as well. We had great group, Greta Werner, Nancy Marshall, Glenn Searle, Nikos Balderston. We also had Samrita Sarkar, Derva Kundu, and Nicole Gurran from University of Sydney and from James Cook University. So these are the main research questions we were looking to answer. What locational, economic, housing and infrastructural characteristics are associated with differences in population growth and decline across non-metropolitan Australia? What place-based push and pull factors help explain decisions to migrate to and remain in regional areas? And we were looking at if there might have been a change more recently as well due to COVID, or we were also looking at the impact of natural disasters as well. And what are the impacts of different growth scenarios for local government? So when we're thinking about population change, we weren't just looking at population growth, we were also looking at population decline and how communities can manage that too. So in order to explore and answer those different research questions, we applied a mixed methods approach. So to answer that first research question, we did an analysis of population change and different place characteristics through statistical modelling. And to answer that second research question, we did an analysis of push and pull factors through community surveys that were conducted in the case study areas that we chose based on that statistical modelling of different high population change areas. And we chose Port Macquarie, Hastings, Ballarat and Broken Hill. And then finally, to look at how different localities might respond, we had 19 interviews with local council and economic development representatives to provide those policy solution ideas and also to talk about their experiences of trying to manage population change. So first I'm going to talk about the findings from modelling different factors associated with population change in non-metropolitan areas. So what we did was basically look at different migration drivers, and to find these different migration drivers, we did a Australian and international literature review to look at common drivers of domestic migration, and then identified some key ones. So amenity, particularly environmental amenity, employment, innovation opportunities, health services, gravity effects as well, so the size of the population or the nearest major city, and dwelling price as well, so looking at cheaper housing as a potential driver. And then to try and model this against population change, we picked out the data that we could try to associate with those drivers, which you can see there. I won't go through all of them. The report is there if you want to go into very specific detail. And we were looking at significant urban areas within a certain population size. So we didn't look at those over 250,000, which is sort of looking at those mid-range size cities. And we were also, our cutoff was also 10,000 people, because we didn't want some smaller communities, it can be skewed if they only have a few more additions to their population. And so, yeah, we sort of kept to that mid-range. So when we modelled the population change from different Australian census periods against those variables that I just described, we found some significant population change factors. A lot of them we kind of expected based on the literature review that we've done. So proximity to coast and to major cities, that's a pretty common one that's often associated with population growth in regional urban areas. Climate factors as well, it's probably not that surprising that warmer temperatures and areas of higher rainfall tend to be more pleasant or attract more people, also associated with tourism industries, and so they tend to be associated with population growth. Towns with higher tertiary education profile as well, so we used how many university lecturers there are in an urban area relative to the population to determine that. And that suggested that was associated with population growth, the proportion of hospitality workers as well, so maybe as an indicator of the tourism industry there. Air transport availability was also an interesting one, and we did try to account for the fact that air transport is often more prevalent in places that already have a higher population, but that did seem to be associated with higher population growth and industry specialization as well. So that was quite interesting. So this is for the pre-pandemic period from 2011 to 2016. Some factors that were negatively associated with population change were higher dwelling prices. So high dwelling prices less associated with population growth. And same with artists and media professionals, which we were not expecting as much. We have some theories as to why that might be, but yeah, not really sure on that one. Okay, so then we ran the same model again with 2016 to 2021. And interestingly, really similar interactions. Not much difference in those findings. And so what we think from this is that it suggests that those underlying factors that influence population change in non-metropolitan Australia continued through COVID-19 and weren't necessarily hugely affected, or at least not picked up in this kind of modelling. So some of the implications for policy development that we came up with based on these findings. The consistency of drivers is perhaps a good thing. It means that we can better anticipate areas of population growth even through quite disruptive events like COVID-19. The tie to university education opportunities, so that university lecturers variable, and population change might suggest that investing more in regional universities could be a really good approach to trying to grow our regional populations, if that's our intent. Also, attention to developing airports in regional areas could be a really good way of building population as well. This one's an interesting one because there can be some concern about instead building a fly-in, fly-out kind of model by improving airport. But it seems, at least from our modelling, that it can actually build permanent resident populations as well. And also, because tourism factors we associate with tourism seem to grow populations as well, really planning for those tourism zones, making sure there's adequate residential land and making sure we're focusing on that for as areas of population growth. Okay, so in answering our second research question, so what place-based push and pull factors help explain decisions to migrate to and remain in regional localities, we looked at some of the place-based factors of population change, and we did this through a community survey. So as I said before, our case study areas were Port Macquarie, Hastings, Broken Hill, and Ballarat. And so you can kind of see we tried to do as much of a spread as we could. We tried to have a diversity of different regional cities, with our limit being the 3 that we could feasibly manage. And so you can kind of see Port Macquarie's coastal community, we tried a coastal community, Ballarat as a larger inland centre, and then Broken Hill as a more remote region. We were also looking for diversity of factors across a number of, across their profiles as well. So you can see Port Macquarie, in terms of the population, we had Ballarat at that sort of higher end, and then Broken Hill at that lower end of our cutoffs. And Port Macquarie and Ballarat as high population growth within the period. And then Broken Hill is an example of ongoing population decline, although that we did see that somewhat abated during the COVID-19 period, which is a bit of an interesting story. And also differences in property prices as well. So we've got Broken Hill with the cheaper property prices and rental prices, and Port Macquarie Hastings with that higher property prices and rental prices. So we ended up surveying, from memory, about 1,300 people. Most of those had moved to our case study areas at some point in their lives, although we did also survey some locals, some people that had lived there all their lives as well, to see if there was any sort of differences there in their perceptions of the area. Most of our sample had moved from major cities, so this was a great way to see the perspective of people that have moved from major cities. So Port Macquarie Hastings, most had moved from Sydney, so 48%, and Ballarat, most had moved from Melbourne. Broken Hill, because it is almost equally distant from everywhere, had lots of different, had people moving from lots of different locations. Okay. Apologies, the figure numbers are all incorrect, but for the presentation, but they associate with the figure numbers in the final report. So if you want to go look at the final report and the explanatory text around that at a later date, you're most welcome to. We asked the survey participants, those that had moved into our case study areas, why they had moved. And mostly the reasons why people had moved were associated with the common reasons in migration literature as why people move. Employment, personal or family reasons, and lifestyle reasons, so we weren't too surprised there. But what was interesting to us was the differences based on the places, and I guess perhaps if you know a little bit about those case study areas might not be so surprising, but still interesting to see play out in the data. So you can see Broken Hill, people are much more likely to state that they moved to Broken Hill for work-related reasons. In Port Macquarie, much more likely to state that they moved for lifestyle-related reasons. For Ballarat, a bit more of a mix, but you can see housing was a bit more significant there than the other case study areas. An important takeaway is that employment is still an important driver of migration. So those regional development agendas that focus on economic development and building jobs and employment in regional areas, it does still seem to have an influence. So not only did we ask about their reasons for deciding to move in general, we also asked specific reasons about their reasons for deciding to move to our specific case study areas. So what was it about the place that actually made them decide to choose that location? And then this was interesting because it was a little bit different to their reason for moving overall. So for example, the main reasons for moving to Port Macquarie Hastings related to different lifestyle, pleasant climate, attractive landscapes. It does seem to relate to lifestyle, which was the main reason. But then if you see Ballarat and Broken Hill, again, a lot of lifestyle and housing related reasons come through for choosing those specific locations. So different lifestyle, better work-life balance came up a lot too, and I'm interested, it wasn't so clear whether that was more of a COVID change, but yeah, definitely something to look into. And Broken Hill as well, better work-life balance and different lifestyle ended up being before work opportunities for choosing that specific place, which was really interesting, even though most people moved to that area for employment reasons. So our takeaway from that, employment is still a really important driver of migration, but some of the reasons for choosing specific locations might be different. So things like lifestyle and housing. So we also differentiated on why people chose to move and where they had come from. So you can see that the capital city versus the people that had moved from regional areas to our case study location. So this is Ballarat. You can see that lifestyle and housing were much more likely to be reasons for moving for people from capital cities than for those that had moved from regional areas. And there was also a bit of a difference between those that had moved more recently and those that had moved that were a bit more established movers to our case study areas. Again, housing and lifestyle seemed to be more common responses in our more recent movers. We also have many people that had had grants or incentives for their relocation as well. So 14% of our migrants to our case study areas had received some kind of grant or incentive, and perhaps unsurprisingly, most of a large chunk of our movers to Broken Hill, so 27%, had some sort of grant or incentive to move there. I assume that there's a lot of impetus for Broken Hill to try to encourage people to move there, since it is having a declining population. So in the open text responses to this, it did seem that these government and industry incentives were contributors to moving decisions, but were not necessarily the main consideration in the reason to move. We also looked at the impact of recent events. So those people that stated that they had moved in the last 5 years, we asked if COVID-19 or if any natural disasters had some influence on their decision to move. And then we also had open text responses for them to describe how it had influenced their move. So you can see 23% of our recent movers had stated that COVID-19 had some influence on their decision to move to our case study areas. And a lot of the reasons for the way in which COVID-19 had influenced moves were things like the ability to telecommute all of a sudden or not needing to physically be in a major city anymore. So this is particularly from major city residents. The experience of lockdown also influencing people to want to move out of particularly Sydney and Melbourne. And then we did have a small number of respondents say that they were influenced by natural disasters. It wasn't huge, it was 3%, but some of the open text responses there were quite, they're relaying some quite horrible experiences of loss of home and real fear of where they were living before and feeling like their new location was safer from natural disasters. Particularly some people saying that Broken Hill seemed pretty safe from bushfires. So we asked them why they moved, why they chose that specific place, but then we were also really interested in this idea of population churn. So it can be really hard for places to manage populations that are changing all the time. It can also impact the social sustainability of the area and building strong communities. So we asked our survey respondents the likelihood of them moving on in the next 5 years. And of our total sample, you can see 30% or more, depending on the case study area, said that they were more likely to move in the next 5 years than they were to stay. And that was definitely highest in Broken Hill. So this indicates that population churn could be a concern for all three LGAs and could potentially counteract any of those population gains that they might have seen during the COVID-19 period. We also saw that a large percentage of the young adults in particular were more likely to move in the next 5 years. This is perhaps not so surprising because this is young adults tend to be more likely to move away from regional areas and particularly to move to major cities or larger cities. And this also might be picking up part of what it might explain some of the population growth in regional areas, which was actually retaining young people that otherwise would have moved into cities that might have been had their plans blocked because of lockdowns or uncertainty around moving into major cities during the pandemic. So we asked why people might consider moving from our case study areas. And so you can see for what's interesting here is we still have those sort of main reasons for just moving in general, which are employment and personal reasons, but they're much less likely to move for lifestyle reasons than they were to move in for lifestyle reasons. So that might suggest that they're actually quite happy with the lifestyle that's offered in these case study areas. But you will note that Broken Hill services available was stated a lot as a reason for moving from Broken Hill. And the remoteness of that particular area means that and the population decline has meant that being able to access services and retain services has been a real challenge there. So then we asked our survey respondents where they might likely to move to. And if you remember, the survey sample itself was mostly people from capital cities or from major cities. And so what was really interesting is if they were to move again, most people said they would move again to a regional city. They wouldn't necessarily move. A lot of people wouldn't move back to a capital city, which was really interesting. And this seems to link to some other findings from other projects that talk about a growing preference for mid-sized cities, and might speak to the challenge or the affordability challenge of moving back to capital cities. So the final question were the impacts of different growth scenarios for local governments and how they can best respond. So I'm going to present the findings from our interviews with local government and economic development stakeholders. We spoke to mostly people associated with our case study area, but also people that oversaw the state of Victoria and New South Wales as well. Okay, so some of the challenges related to trying to manage population change in the case study areas were things like road and transport infrastructure in both a population growth and a population decline scenario. So in Port Macquarie Hastings, there was discussions about challenges around growing traffic and the roads being difficult to maintain there. And then in Broken Hill, there was the challenge of trying to maintain costly and lengthy road infrastructure to be able to connect with other regional cities and towns in inland Australia. So a real challenge there. And also a very essential piece of infrastructure for people in Broken Hill, especially with at the time that I was travelling there for this project. The train was down, it may still be down. So really the road transport is the only other connection except for air, which obviously only has certain nodes. Water infrastructure as well. In Broken Hill, they talked about water security. In Port Macquarie Hastings, they talked about the sheer increase in roofs and having to manage the stormwater from that. As more housing is being developed to cater to the growing population there. Health services was also a big one. The increase in people showing up to emergency departments was something that was challenging to manage in Macquarie Hastings, and retaining specialist services was a real challenge in Broken Hill. Education and training was discussed a lot as well. So making sure that you can, especially for Port Macquarie Hastings that had a big growth in families with children, making sure that there was enough spaces in their both public and private schools. And tertiary education was a concern as well. And childcare was another concern too. So there was a really great quote from Roy Butler, the member for Barwon, which covers Broken Hill, who says, in terms of the next bottleneck that we've got, especially relevant to higher income earners and professionals, is childcare. So people are less likely to be able to move to a place where they can't actually find spaces for their children to be cared for while they work. And that was a big concern in trying to attract particular types of professionals or workers. Housing and planning was also discussed quite a lot. Housing is just a huge physical barrier to being able to either take advantage of an increase in demand for a particular area. If you just don't have the housing stock, you can't actually, you just can't accommodate a growing population, or trying to match and not affect a local housing market if you are experiencing quite intense population growth. And that was something discussed a lot in Port Macquarie Hastings. There were concerns about house prices at that time. And then finally, another thing that came through was the concerns around key worker attraction and retention. So not only how many people are moving, but if you can get the right essential workers to be able to service that new or changing population. And that was really interesting because that really related to the rest of the concerns as well. So some communities were talking about real struggles in attracting key workers based on the fact they didn't have appropriate housing to actually house key workers in their communities. Again, the childcare came up as a barrier to that. Or trying to upskill people within their local area to be an essential worker is challenging if they don't have TAFE campuses or tertiary education services. So some of the solutions that were discussed related to those kinds of challenges that came up. So for infrastructure and services, a lot of the participants talked about really needing to coordinate across different tiers of government, really needing to coordinate with industry and private sector, because a lot of those concerns require all different tiers of government to be able to approve and quickly respond to those road and transport and service concerns. For housing and planning, it was really interesting to hear from Broken Hill. So they are expecting some population growth in the future. And so in order to try to prepare for that, they're coming up with creative solutions to try to increase their housing stock. And that in some cases they're getting their local council to buy up abandoned houses for auction so that they can quickly increase their housing stock there. And for upskilling and key worker attraction, there's either trying to come up with ways to attract those key workers by covering off on all those bases and really focusing on what the livability of an area is like, but also focusing on upskilling the local community as well to make sure that you can upskill within the area as opposed to just trying to influence people to move in as well. And the benefit of that is upskilling within the area, you might be more likely to retain someone long term. You can build more community connections, particularly people that might be working in education, whereas some key worker attraction programs, if people are just staying for a short-term contract, they might not build those longer-term relationships. Yes. So just in conclusion, sort of bringing it all together. So how can regional pull factors be strengthened and push factors be addressed? So it was evident from both the modelling and also from our survey that employment's still a really big reason why people might move out of major cities into regional areas. So the focus and the agenda on economic development and growing jobs in regional areas is still very important. Also, promoting and maintaining those place-specific lifestyle and amenity attributes can be really important too. And this is part of both the attraction to specific locations, but also part of that retention story as well, and trying to retain populations for places that are trying to grow. Enhancing local infrastructure and services, again, that's part of that livability story, making it, that's not a reason. Nobody said that they were moving to a location because of its local buses, but it can be having good services when you get there can be part of the decision making to want to stay and want to remain as part of the community. Increasing housing and rental stock and diversity and ensuring housing affordability, really important. A concern for all of the communities was making sure that they physically have the spaces for people to move into, but also making sure that they also weren't oversupplying, and those interactions with the market that can be very finicky and very challenging for sort of smaller markets. And key and skilled worker attraction and retention, which I had discussed before. And so two big themes came through from the three parts of the project. Is timing and preparedness was something that really came through. Being able to time your response with these changes in population is really important. Making sure that the needs are being met as the population grows and as the population changes, and you're meeting specific needs of the new population as well as the local community to retain population too. And that preparedness story, part of another project within this overall inquiry was looking at how to improve population predictions as well, and that's really important for smaller urban centres to be able to actually predict their populations so they can have that preparedness. And finally, coordination and cooperation of different place-based interventions, which requires a good conversations at both that local level that might know some of those more place-specific needs and attributes, with the different tiers of government, with industry, and with the private sector as well. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening. I'm very keen to answer any questions. I just feel like I breezed over the methodology. So if anyone has any methodological questions that aren't related to the statistical modelling, then that's great. Yes.
Thanks, Caitlin. It was really interesting. It seems from listening to the different stories of the different locations that it's not just about encouraging growth, but it's about encouraging managed growth that's not too quick.
Yes.
Were there any insights from your final round of interviews about that? About like how do we grow in a manageable way? Maybe from the Port Macquarie people, where it sounds like maybe it went a little bit faster than manageable.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it was interesting because it was hearing different perspectives with people that had different control over different facets. And so it wasn't necessarily that it was, I mean, it didn't seem completely out of control, but it just seemed like there was sort of cracks forming in certain areas that that still has a bit of a lag time. So, for example, it's very hard to just build a childcare centre immediately as soon as it's needed. So there is a bit of lag time there that is causing, I guess, like pain points. So not necessarily completely unmanageable, but I did get a sense in the Broken Hill case study, because they are expecting, with the opening of different new businesses there, they are expecting a bit of population growth. I think that is something that they're aware of, is not wanting to have unmanaged population growth if that's in their future, and trying to be prepared for that. So yeah, I think it is a concern there. Yeah, I didn't necessarily get a sense of complete chaos, but definitely those pain points that, and there is a concern, I suppose, if you're expecting lots of people and really prepare for that, but then it ends up only being a temporary growth and then a retraction, and that can be a real concern. So that's sort of the other side of that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions from home, so we can do Ali first.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Madam.
Yay. That was really great presentation. Thank you, Caitlin. I had a question, and again, I'm sorry if you went over this and I missed it or I looked away while you were talking about it, but I'm curious about kind of cultural diversity, because a lot of these, regional centres are often not incredibly ethnically diverse. And I was just wondering if you came across, when you were doing research, what, how they were kind of looking at cultural diversity in terms of, both from a social and a infrastructural perspective, like, building infrastructural spaces that meet different cultural needs, something that came up. Yeah, just curious.
That's a really good question. We did ask about background, and to be honest, we didn't see much significance in terms of, we probably didn't ask enough questions in the community survey to pick up on that, I would say. We did have, where people have moved from, we did pick up some people that had moved from overseas, but we didn't ask about cultural background, so we wouldn't have been able to pick up on that in the community survey. And it didn't really come up that much in the interviews, as far as I'm aware. There was perhaps some open text responses that might have been related to that. But that would be really interesting. So that might be something that will influence me to go back through my data and see.
Thank you.
We can do Ken's question next. Yeah. Okay, that's all right. We'll do another one in the meantime anyway. There's another question in the chat. It says, I'm interested in the innovate housing ideas, like find the abandoned houses in Broken Hill. Were there any other ideas for this in the research?
In housing, there was someone who talked about temporary planning instruments as well, to try and to sort of free up land for development really quickly in, if there's a really immediate demand. I think that was something that had been done in Queensland from memory, which one of the participants talked about as something that might be useful. But it was just discussed a lot. We were trying to come up with some really good solutions, but the main one was just being able to try to forecast what your population change is going to be as accurately as possible, and then trying to plan ahead for that. And so trying to be more proactive about it than being reactive about it seemed to be the main point there. Yeah, trying to think of the other creative ones off the top of my head. There's been some discussion about the departments of justice, education, and health also having dedicated essential worker or key worker housing as well in regional areas too. So that's sort of a way to entice to have housing, but also encourage those particular groups as well. Yeah, I'll try to think of some more, but yes, that's a good question. Okay. Oh, we're getting a few more questions in now. All right, so Ken's put in his question. He said, do you feel it is possible to identify packages or a mix of incentives and drivers for different towns and develop action plans based on these? Yeah, my advice would be to ask the towns themselves. So one thing that came through is that the local communities themselves had a really good sense of why people like their area and what they needed. And so rather than perhaps having some broad ideas of what specific communities should do, or saying, coastal communities can do this, although that can be helpful guidance, it did seem that the local communities themselves had really great ideas, and being able to for them to be able to speak to higher levels of government and have funding support for some of those ideas was that a lot of the interview participants talked about that as being really helpful. So yeah, no broad fantastic silver bullets, but the communities themselves being able to come up with their plans. But they also need really good information about how their population is growing to be able to also come up with those plans too. So,
Chris.
Caitlin, thanks for a great presentation. You mentioned a couple of times reasons under the category personal. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering, as opposed to lifestyle, what are the sorts of things, because there seem to be a lot of people, a big chunk, that are affected moving out and possibly even because of personal reasons.
Yeah, so those reasons were mostly, so we just sort of collapsed that into just personal to describe what was things like moving to be closer to a family member, or to be closer to friends, or related to their existing social networks. And so that was quite a big driver. And I guess I probably skimmed over that one because I was like, we don't have as much control over that as we might, thinking about employment and lifestyle. But I mean, it does mean that it does suggest that people are more likely to move to places where they might already know someone. So there is that chain migration idea as well. So yeah, that's pretty much what that one was.
Okay.
Yeah.
This follows from the answer you gave before to Chris B. There's been times in Australian history when there were new state movements and big visions about decentralised population and decentralised political power as well, and different ways of governing. And there were ideas about regional, some sort of regional organisation below the level of the states, but that could be resourced. Are there any ideas like that for reorganising governance that are having a renaissance out there as well?
I'm not super sure about that. There are a vast array of different regional bodies that have different controls. But I did, in talking to some of the state departments that look at regional development, so Regional New South Wales and Regional Development Victoria, I think as well, they seem like kind of good communicators across a couple of different sectors. So there was discussion about not necessarily having specific powers, but at least being a good coordinating body between different tiers. But yes, I'm not sure about those conversations. That's a good question.
We have another question from Ken Marriott. He's asked, do you feel that on the basis of the research, you could develop a framework for analysing other cities and towns that councils and communities could apply? And down to what size do you feel your research findings might apply? For example, is there a point where local factors override broader issues?
That's a good question. I'll answer the first one. The community survey is actually at the end of the report, so any community is welcome to try and ask the same questions or adapt that community survey if they'd like to run that themselves and try to find, why people moved in and how long people might want to stay and what they like about the place. So a lot of the community survey was not just about the moving in and out aspect, but also about the place attributes itself. So there's that. And sorry, what was the second part of the question? Can you just remind me?
Yeah, so the second one is down to what size do you feel your research findings might apply? So is there a point where local factors might override broader issues?
I think it's probably more appropriate at this urban centre level. I think if it starts to get to small towns, it might be harder to apply some of these findings. Although there's the general advice about thinking about livability of an area could apply anywhere and pretty much at any size. But yeah, I think it'd be hard to make similar conclusions at a much more finer grained detail. And in terms of the local versus broader issues, I think it just depends on how the community actually experiences what seems like a local issue versus some of those bigger issues. Again, I want to talk about the difference between encouraging someone to move in, which is quite different to what you might need to do to make people stay. So for different places, you might need to focus on a different aspect of that. So for example, Port Macquarie is already encouraging, is already growing, and I think they're happy with that. They might need to have a focused attempt at who they want to encourage to move in, but it seems like their focus is more now on how to retain people and also how to meet the needs of their growing population and their current local population. Yeah, hopefully I answered the question.
Yeah, no, definitely. Alright. Well, thank you so much, Caitlin, for sharing your insights with us today. It's been great. Our next seminar series will be held on the 3rd of April, and our guest speaker will be Halvard Dalheim. Halvard has 4 decades of experience as a strategic planner covering the state and local government and private sector, including roles as an executive in the New South Wales and Victorian state government planning departments and the Greater Sydney Commission. Thank you for your time, and I hope you all have a lovely afternoon.